Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we really appreciate you joining us for today's show. Join me for a little thought experiment. Let's say you are enjoying a quiet evening home alone, when suddenly, and without warning, a series of unexplainable and frightening events occur. Perhaps, like in the case of the Enfield poltergeist, which we examined in episode 71, objects have started flying through the air. Or, as was the case in the Sally House, which we looked at in episode 89, scratches caused by invisible hands are appearing all over your body. You are confused, maybe in shock, but most likely you are scared. Very, very scared. Perhaps even for your life. What would you do next? Each year, countless calls are made to the police looking for help with these kind of unique situations. These calls provides access to law enforcement of sites of extremely recent or still occurring paranormal activity. In the episode, we will be joined by Elliott Van Dusen, a retired member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and a paranormal investigator, to discuss the intriguing reports he has collected from the front line of our law enforcement. But before we get to that, I do have some news to share. As of the final weekend in November, we will be postponing tours with the Haunted Walk until at least a few months down the line. We're making this decision out of respect and safety of our tour guides, and of course also to follow local health guidelines and put our business in the best position to succeed and be able to survive the pandemic. Luckily, we do have a few digital products ongoing that if you're interested in doing a spooky experience with us over the next few months, no problem there. We are continuing our Haunting at Home, which is our guided audio experience where we challenge you to conduct a series of paranormal experiments in the dark. The really cool part about this is we are collecting all the data from all the experimenters, trying to get an inside look at just how haunted our homes might be. We also have our virtual haunted campfires from Halloween, and we have hopes of doing another one in early December. Those products are available and will be available for the next few months, and you can also buy gift certificates if you would like to give them as a gift this holiday season. Information on both of those can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Don't worry, there still will be new episodes of Haunted Talks from time to time. Also, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the show so you know when the new episodes are coming out. And we always appreciate getting those 5-star reviews. Elliott Van Dusen, thank you for joining us, thank you for your service, and welcome to Haunted Talks.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
I was very interested when I saw you had a new book out, Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement. And that's because it's a topic that I've been really interested in and wanted to explore for quite some time. But before we get to a few of the stories you wrote about in the book, I wonder if you could share with us a little of your rather unique background, which involves both a career in law enforcement as well as a strong interest in the paranormal and even parapsychology.
Yeah, absolutely. It started when I was a child. Unsolved mysteries is what got me interested in the paranormal. And I always had an interest in law enforcement as well. So I guess Unsolved Mysteries really pulled me into that because a lot of it would be shows on homicide, which is what I always wanted to be, was a homicide detective. And then the other parts of Unsolved Mysteries were your ghost stories, your UFO stories. And then as I got older, in 1993 when X-Files came out, that kind of got me interested in investigating the paranormal. And when I moved to Halifax around 1997, I got involved with my colleague Daryl Walsh, who's a parapsychologist, and he was teaching some courses at the Nova Scotia Community College. So I had signed up to take 2 of those, and I was eventually asked to join his investigative group, which was called the Centre for Parapsychological Studies in Canada at the time. And I ended up getting some practical investigative experience. And then when I was in university at St. Mary's University in Halifax, in 2005, I got recruited by the Rcmp. So from there, I spent my time focusing on law enforcement and developing, my new career. And I still had an interest in the paranormal, but I wasn't doing it publicly. I was more doing it privately, like keeping up on the literature and things like that. I ended up eventually getting onto the RCMP doesn't have a homicide unit per se, unless you're in the Lower Mainland. They have the Integrated Homicide Investigative Team, but the homicide teams with RCMP are called Major Crime Unit. So I ended up spending a lot of my career doing major crime work, so I got to end up doing homicide investigations. And then just before I retired in May of this year, I'd say about a year before that, I started to kind of get publicly involved in the paranormal again.
And how long did you work for the RCMP? For our listeners outside of Canada, of course, that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our federal law enforcement arm.
I ended up doing 15 years service with RCMP.
As you point out in the book, individuals in law enforcement, or I think we could include EMTs, paramedics, those kind of fields as well, work in the environments often associated with ghost stories, scenes of traumatic deaths, significant violence, tragedy. But also on the other side, I think, is if someone is experiencing some kind of frightening encounter, potentially with the paranormal, it's often the police who are called in for help. Which makes me curious, do law enforcement personnel typically receive any training in regards to dealing with potentially paranormal situations? Or are you aware of any policies in place that deal with the paranormal?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jim. I think when people are afraid or something's going on, it's kind of ingrained in us that you call 911. So there have been cases where people have phoned the police to respond, for example, to poltergeist activity because they don't know who else to call. There's no training that I'm aware of that law enforcement receives to deal with supernatural phenomena. A lot of times they'll go and if they do end up witnessing something, like in poltergeist cases, there's been incidents where police have witnessed items being tossed around and items breaking spontaneously, items levitating, like couches, fridges, beds. They'll reach out to the church and ask for assistance there, but other than that, there's really no training at all that can prepare the police to respond to a supernatural encounter.
It's really interesting. And over your career, and I assume obviously in researching the book as well, and have met a lot of folks in law enforcement, your direct colleagues, but even those, further afield. What would you say are the prominent attitudes toward the paranormal from the rank and file of the RCMP, for example? Is it a reflection of kind of our beliefs in society, or is there something specific about the people drawn to law enforcement that might influence those beliefs one way or another?
Well, I think there's a couple of different angles with that question for sure. I think for the most part, because police are trained to collect the facts and look for evidence at crime scenes and stuff like that, whenever they encounter the supernatural, it kind of defies what their training has taught them to do and what their logical thinking has trained them to do. So whenever they encounter something like that, a lot of times they don't really know how to deal with it, or they don't process what's happening until after the fact. and they can kind of sit there and digest what happened. The other thing that I've noticed, and it's funny, I guess it depends on where you're at. I've talked to other U.S. police officers that said, they had like a guy that was doing paranormal investigations while being a police officer, and they kind of looked at him like the resident expert, and, anything that they came across that was unusual or whatnot, they'd ask for his advice and his opinions. Whereas it's been more my experience that you receive, a lot of ridicule, jokes, people not taking you seriously with the paranormal. So when I decided to write Supernatural Encounters, I wasn't really sure if I would end up having enough stories to put out a book. So I just started by reaching out to people that I knew involved in law enforcement and asking them, like, hey, have you ever had any experiences? I'm thinking about writing this book. And because they knew me as a police officer, and then they knew my interest in the paranormal, I don't know if it's just they felt comfortable talking to me, but they ended up providing stories after stories after stories. And before I knew it, I had collected, somewhere just over 50 stories for this book here. And since the book has been released, I've actually had more law enforcement people contact me with more stories. So I'm trying to figure out what I should do from there. And now, mind you, some of them didn't want their real names used for whatever reasons, like because they're afraid that their coworkers will ridicule them, or if they're involved in undercover work and they didn't want their name associated to being a police officer or whatnot. So in the book, there's a lot of pseudonyms, but I was actually surprised at how open people were and how comfortable they felt with me to share their stories.
It makes me wonder what your perspective is wearing those two hats, as both being involved in law enforcement, but also very much as a paranormal investigator. Do you think that prevalent attitude amongst law enforcement of almost a discomfort with the paranormal or fear of ridicule, do you think that's kind of slowing down or blocking our ability in some ways to kind of research the paranormal as well, just as these folks like yourself are usually on the front lines dealing with these situations directly? If that attitude was to shift, what do you think the ramifications would be for that? Are we missing out on key things because of the skepticism or fear of ridicule involved?
I think it would be fair to say that we are. An example, one of the stories that's in Supernatural Encounters came from the Coventry Police Department in Rhode Island. And how I became aware of that story was they actually had a call from somebody, a citizen. It was a few days before Halloween, and they said that somebody had reported seeing a person in a white dress or a white wedding dress that was screaming and running down the road, looked like they needed help. So they phoned the police. The police sent 2 officers there to make a patrol. They didn't come across anything. Everything seemed to be in order. And they actually posted on their Facebook page 2 things. One, they said that they had received that call and that they attended there and didn't find anything, but if anyone has any further information to please contact the police department. And secondly, they didn't do it in like a mocking way or anything like that. They actually posted that there is a local ghost in the area named Nellie Vaughn, who people believe that she may have been a vampire, and that she's often seen in the area, reported by people. And she basically tells people that she's fine and that she's not a vampire. It's really, for whatever reason, this ghost, and maybe that's why she's still wandering around, is it's really important that people know she's not a vampire. But they actually told that story, and like I said, they didn't do it in like a mocking or a ridicule way. It was close to Halloween, but it wasn't even like a joking kind of Halloween post. It was, it was a legitimate post. So I was actually down Rhode Island at the time and decided to go out to the graveyard where Nellie Vaughn is buried. And unfortunately, her headstone has been stolen, so you can't exactly see where in the cemetery she's buried. But about 2 minutes before I got to the cemetery, the vehicle I was in, the windshield wipers started going all by themselves, and it was a crystal clear day. There was no moisture or rain or anything like that. Actually, the driver had to turn the auto off so that the wipers would stop, but they continued to go even though the auto mode wasn't on. So that was really strange. And it didn't stop until we got to the cemetery and parked the car, and then the wipers stopped. That was the only thing that happened when I went out there. Other people said that when they're there, they've seen apparitions, or they've had people, like, you know, scratch them, or they've heard voices or anything like that. I didn't see or witness anything like that. The only thing I had happen that was really strange was the windshield wipers were going on a completely dry day for 2 minutes and didn't stop until we got to the cemetery. So I think that there are definitely stories out there that may help parapsychologists understand the phenomena a little bit better if we had that kind of information. Obviously, we only know about that because the police department posted on their Facebook. In my book, I talk about some of the UFO cases that the Rcmp used to investigate back in the 60s and 70s. I was able to get those reports through Freedom of Information Act requests, and anyone can do that if you fill out the form and apply to National Archives. You can get a copy of, they're called RG18 files, a record group 18 files is where they're kept at. Another story in Supernatural Encounters, a friend of mine told me about the Bushman, which is up in Wati, Northwest Territories, and he actually would get calls to go and investigate. People thought that at 2 a.m, the Bushman was breaking in their house. So where someone called 911 and the police were dispatched, there's obviously a paper record of that, and that's something that, it's not released to the public, obviously. I only learned that through my friend and his investigation. So I can't imagine how many other stories there are that we don't know about, because when the police release stuff to the media, it's usually for public safety issues, or, it's a big incident. There was a homicide, a robbery, serious car accident, and they had to shut down the road. So we're getting all those releases, but we're not getting, any sort of like supernatural releases from police departments and investigative agencies. In the book, there was a poltergeist case from Scotland, and the Scotland police went and investigated it. And I tried to go through the Freedom of Information Act there, and they denied me access to the file. And I wrote back and I said, well, I learned about it through the newspaper, and the newspaper gives all these details, and I listed out the details. They had like the street name, the house number. One of the newspapers might have even identified the family. And I said, so it's not really like that you're releasing anything that's not out to the public already. And I said, I understand, like, being a police officer myself, that you have to redact certain information, like personal information, like people's birth dates and phone numbers and stuff like that. So I expect them to release at least some document after it's been redacted, but they were like adamant that they weren't going to release anything. All they said was that they responded to a call at a house and it wasn't criminal in nature. That's all that they would say, which is pretty much the only thing that they told the newspaper as well. So I do try, like, if I get a tip like that, I'll try and get that type of information.
Now, of course, our audience love a good ghost story, and there are several in the book that are really fascinating. Is there one in particular that you really enjoy sharing?
The one that seems to be most popular is at the Helivax Provincial Courthouse, which is located on Spring Garden Road in downtown Halifax. It was a place where they used to do hangings back in the day. And back in the day, obviously, we didn't waste anything. So once the gallows that they used to hang people with were finished, they didn't waste the wood, and apparently they used a lot of the wood from the gallows to do renovations in the courthouse, especially the attic. So a lot of the staff that work at the courthouse have reported strange things happening in the attic. One thing that happened was a cleaner had actually seen an apparition of a ghost up in the attic, and it scared him so bad that he refused to clean the attic anymore. One of my sheriff friends that was telling me, he worked there for 7 years, he said anytime that they would do renovations to the courthouse, if they ripped up a floorboard or took down a wall, they would find old leather shoes hidden within the wall. I had never heard about that. And I said, okay. And it's like, so what do you think the meaning of that is? And he's like, well, they tell us that they were hidden back in the day to ward off evil spirits. So I started doing some more research into it, and I actually found out that archaeologists have known this since the 1500s, that humans used to hide old leather shoes and other weird things such as dried out cat skulls and stuff like that into floorboards in the houses to ward off evil spirits and demons. And I started thinking about it, and I've been to some investigations involving Roman Catholic families, and it's really not much different from what they do. A lot of Roman Catholics have medallions, blessed medallions, hidden at all four corners of their house, or they have crosses or crucifix over all the doorways, or they have prayer cards, set up all over the house. So it's really, when you think about it, I mean, obviously we're not putting dried out dead cats in our wall anymore, but it's obviously something that humans have believed in for a very long time, and we still continue to do that to this day. So the other interesting thing that happened at that courthouse as well is one night my friend was working, and he said there was 3 sheriffs and 2 cleaners working, so they were divvying up the task for the night. And his task was to go underneath the grand staircase when you walk into the courthouse. And there's a long, narrow hallway that runs underneath it that leads eventually to the cells and to the judge's chambers and stuff like that. So he swiped his swipe card, and he opened the door up. And as he was opening the door up, he said it distinctly felt like somebody had grabbed a hold of the door and tugged it from his hand, and it slammed shut. So he thought that there was somebody loose, possibly from cells, behind the grand staircase. So he swiped his card really quick again, ripped the door open, and when he looked in, there was absolutely no one in the hallway. And he swears it wasn't, because I've even had it happen to me when a gust of wind or whatever takes the door from you. But he swears it wasn't that. It was a distinct feeling that somebody had grabbed the door handle from him and ripped it from his hands.
Now, one of the most important parts for a truly compelling ghost story such as that one, and the believability issue as well, is kind of the credibility of the eyewitnesses involved in these kind of events. And I'm wondering, given that law enforcement receives specialized training in things like observation, quickly assessing situations, do you think officers in general are more reliable witnesses? And if that's true, does that mean that paranormal accounts from law enforcement should be considered with more weight than a report from a regular citizen?
Oh, that's a really good question. Certainly in the court system, we put weight into a police officer's testimony, for example. So I think people do put more weight into when you have a supernatural encounter being relayed by law enforcement. And a lot of times it's been my experience, even in my book when I was interviewing people, they would say, listen, I don't believe in ghosts or whatever, but I had this experience that I can't explain, and this is what happened. And they would tell you the story, and it was a supernatural story. It was, they'd see apparitions or whatever. But they're saying themselves, they're like, I don't believe in this, but I had this experience, and I can't explain it, and this is what I saw. And I think that does hold a lot of weight. But I also think, most of our reports, generally speaking, are coming from just regular people that have regular jobs, and they have been since the beginning of time. So, I think everybody's story is important, but I do think that there is a certain amount of weight that is placed on, professional witnesses, and police officers and military personnel are considered professional witnesses. And the other thing that I liked about some of the stories in the book was actually from my brother-in-law that was the air traffic controller. He had a couple of UFO experiences, so it was really interesting to hear him talk about like the level of height that the object would have been at, and what conventional aircraft can fly at that level, and the speeds and stuff like that, because he's trained to understand all that. And I think that plays a lot to have like an expert that can, say, look, it wasn't an airplane because of this or that. And there was another UFO sighting in the book as well, that the guy's job was, he was in the Navy, and his job was to spot strange objects out in the sea so that they wouldn't hit any hazards or whatever, and he reported a UFO sighting. So to get somebody that's his job, is to look out on the choppy ocean during stormy weather and make sure that there's no objects that the ship's going to hit or whatever, to have this UFO experience and say, it wasn't this, it wasn't that. I think it just brings a little bit more weight to the story.
I've always been very interested in in UFOs and UFO stories. And it kind of ties into my previous question. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Stephen Greer, who's very big in ufology. But his Disclosure Project, a number of years ago, when he brought forth the exact kind of expert professional witnesses and testimony that you're talking about, from airplane pilots, radar controllers, military, governmental personnel, it's such an interesting topic. And I do wonder if and we've seen in the past couple of the years, UFO stories and video footage even, going into the mainstream media in a way we hadn't before. And I kind of wonder what that means for, the future of UFOs in particular. But I do love UFO stories. And there's a number in the book that I really enjoyed reading. Is there one that you find particularly powerful or interesting as you were doing the research?
I do like the Shag Harbor story. So Shag Harbor was a UFO, had allegedly crashed off the coast of Nova Scotia. And it's been called Canada's version of Roswell, but the only difference between this is that we have a lot of really good documentation because the Rcmp responded to the initial call. So we have all the Rcmp reports from there. We have multiple witnesses involved. The Canadian Coast Guard actually helped out with the recovery efforts afterwards, and so did the U.S. Coast Guard. So it's actually a very well government documented crash of a UFO. And what happened is on October 4th in 1967, a lot of people around Nova Scotia were seeing strange lights in the sky, right up from Halifax down the west coast of Nova Scotia to this little tiny fishing village called Shag Harbor. And what happened is a bunch of witnesses were driving their car. They saw what looked like a plane descending. It was a light. It was descending very slowly. They kind of thought, why is this plane descending? It looks like it's kind of heading towards the ocean. And next thing you know, they hear a big crash. So they called the local Rcmp detachment. And at first, the Rcmp detachment thought that it was a prank. But then all of a sudden, the phone lines started lighting up, and there was many other people reporting that they saw something crash into the waters off Shag Harbor. So the Rcmp attend, the local witnesses that phoned it in were there. Some of the local fishermen and stuff like that started to come down to the scene. They got their fishing boats all ready to go. The Rcmp jumped on it. They actually saw a dim yellow light underneath the water. There was strange yellow foam that was on the water that the fishermen said they had never seen before. And that, I think, is also very good to have fishermen that spend their entire life on the ocean to say, like, this isn't sea foam, like, we don't know what it is, it's not an oil slick, but there was this weird, strange foam that was kind of sparkling or glistening, and all of a sudden the light kind of just disappeared, and they couldn't find any luggage, they couldn't find any wreckage, they couldn't see the light anymore. And the search continued for several days afterwards. And again, they got the Canadian Coast Guard involved, and they couldn't find anything. There's a second story that kind of spins off that, but this second story is kind of less documented, if you will. But the second story is that allegedly the UFO had traveled under the water up to a Canadian military base where a second object was later seen, and it was a military base up around Shelburne, and a second object was seen arriving, went underneath the water, made repairs to the object, and then they both took off. And one of the leading researchers on the Shag Harbor story is a friend of mine, Chris Stiles. So he's again, he can't seem to find much real documentation for that part of the story. He has interviewed Navy divers and things like that have told him off the record that story and things like that. Kind of adds a bit of mystique to it, but I don't know if I believe the second story as much as I do the first story. I mean, the first story is pretty evident. You've got multiple witnesses that saw an object crash. You got police officers that went out with fishermen that saw a light underneath there. We know it's a UFO. It's an unidentified flying object. Something crashed there. What it was, I mean, we don't know. And that's always been probably not just because I'm from Nova Scotia, but it's probably been one of my favorite UFO stories. And again, it's a significant UFO story, especially for Canadian history.
Yeah, it's a great one and compelling, as you research it further, no doubt about that. Now, many of our listeners, of course, are also, like yourself, members of paranormal investigation teams or have a really strong interest in that area. Now, you have your own team. We discussed Paranormal Phenomena Research and Investigation, PPRI.
Yes.
And I would have to think that those in law enforcement who are interested in the paranormal, for the reasons we've already discussed, kind of be ideal investigators, systems of doing things, observational skills, documentation, all the stuff that would normally kind of go with the job. Looking through your law enforcement lens and that experience, are there any suggestions, practices, or philosophies that you would encourage other paranormal teams to consider as part of their own investigations or research?
When PPRI was at its biggest, we actually had chapters. We had a chapter in Ontario, Canada. We had a chapter in BC. We had a chapter in Boston. And we had a chapter in Nova Scotia. But what I found, ironically, same as any large corporation or even the Rcmp, for example, the bigger the organization is, the more you rely on the people that you've empowered to operate it. And if they're not up to your standards or whatnot, things can go pretty south pretty quick. It's pretty hard to manage large organizations and not have your political issues. So what we have now is PPRI is just a very small team of people that have certain expertise, for example. So myself, my colleague Daryl Walsh, who's a parapsychologist, he's also got training in hypnosis, which I don't. So that's kind of good. He brings something else to the table. My brother-in-law, who is retired Canadian Air Force air traffic controller. So he brings a lot of interesting perspectives, especially to our UFO cases, because he's got that background and that understanding. And then my common law, Sarah, who doesn't have any parapsychology background at all, but she is very good at making us work to present the proof of whether or not like a place is haunted or maybe haunted or not. So, and it's the same as a police officer. You might not be like the best like physically fit person or whatnot, but if you have that solid critical mind, that could be very important to be a good investigator. And that's what Sarah brings to the table. And then I have my friend Chad, again, who doesn't have any parapsychology training per se, but he's got a background in history and research. So he's kind of like my go-to guy for researching documents. And he works for the library in Halifax, so he's got access to ordering certain books and research items in for me that I've used him extensively as well. So certainly I find working with a smaller group of people that have their own expertise it's a lot more fluid and functional for sure.
Yeah, that sounds like a small but mighty team, and that there's a lot of different skills and experiences there that would be very useful in investigations for sure.
You have a parapsychologist, you have a ex-RCMP officer, you have an ex-Canadian Forces military air traffic controller, so there's all that training as well. And like you said, you can take some of that training and apply it to parapsychology. For example, like the police get lots of interviewing courses. So I find that, now that I'm retired from policing and just focusing on the paranormal, I'm probably a lot better at interviewing people now than I was 15 years ago before I had all that training. And I'm able to take, the interviewing skills that I've learned through the police and apply it to it when you have to interview a homeowner that is having an experience or someone that's having an experience. If I was to give some people some advice, certainly I think the interview part is really important. I like to, at the minimum, audio record it because then it's documented in its truest form rather than taking handwritten notes or having somebody try and explain their situation through email. From my experience, is never good. I mean, they always reach out to you initially by email asking for help, and then when you ask them for the details, like you don't get a very detailed response back. So it's definitely best to, if you can, make the time to sit down with people face to face, audio video recorded if you can. And then that way too, you can see any other influences that might be happening. Like there's times where I've gone to houses and there might be a spouse that's kind of putting some pressure on the person to either tell the story or maybe not tell the story because they're worried that people are going to think they're crazy or whatnot. So by being there physically, you're able to kind of pick up things in the environment that you might not necessarily get, through email or even over the phone. The other thing is if people are looking for proper education in the parapsychology, there's obviously not much out there, but one of the really good spots that you can check out is the Rhine Education Center, and that was started after J.B. Rhine, who left Duke University. Duke University back in the day had its own parapsychology lab, and when that ended, Rhine created the Rhine Research Center, which is in North Carolina. And they do courses every so often. It's all online. They actually started doing some really cool stuff where it's kind of like mandatory Skype in-class type sessions. So I've actually participated in one of those courses. It was called 8 Important Studies in Parapsychology. So that was really cool because not only did they have the students all there and it was interactive as opposed to a regular online course, they actually had the people that were involved in the study come on as guest speakers. So you actually got to talk to the people that conducted the study and ask them questions directly. So it's a really great place for people that are looking to kind of maybe improve their skill sets a little bit. Because I do see some people in the field, I follow groups on Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that, and I do see some misinformation still being pushed out there. For example, like one thing, some people still think poltergeists are ghosts, spirits, and in parapsychology, that's not what the labs and stuff have determined. So poltergeist is usually caused by psychokinesis phenomena. That's not a spirit. There's certain things that are different in a poltergeist case compared to a haunting. So for example, poltergeist cases are usually short-lived. They can last as quick as a week and a half, whereas a haunting is normally longer term, that it can last years. And in poltergeist cases, apparitions don't show up. And if they do show up, they look distorted, like black shadow type blobs, but it's very rare. Whereas in a haunting, people see, partial apparitions, full apparitions. So I do see a lot of misinformation still out there. So, there's lots of experts out there conducting research and stuff like that. I think it's important that people tune into that.
Well, Elliott Van Dusen, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. Certainly I'll be following your work with great interest. I know that our listeners will be interested in both your book and following you as well. Where's the best place for people to go to get the book and to continuing following you and your latest adventures?
The best place to get the book right now, probably your best bet is Amazon.com or .ca. I know they usually offer free shipping, so you can get Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement on both Amazon.com and .ca. You can also get it through Chapter's website. If you're in Canada, you can order it through Chapter's. Or if you're in the States, you can order it through Barnes & Noble. They've got it on their website as well. And then if you go to ppri.net, that'll bring you to Paranormal Phenomena Research and Investigations website, and from there you can contact us. It's got my author website, so it's got my 2 books listed there. You can get in touch with us, and you can see any sort of events that are coming up. There's not obviously a whole lot of events going on right now with the COVID second wave outbreak, but when this podcast is released, I'll post it on there, and people can go to your website and take a look at it, so you can kind of stay up to date by visiting there.
Thanks so much to Elliott for joining us on the episode. And as always, thank you for joining us and listening. A special holiday shout out to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and to Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.filmmusic.io for the additional music. Visit our website, hauntedwalk.com, to learn more about the haunting at home and our virtual campfires. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all 3 at Haunted Walk. Until we meet again, Sweet dreams.